Jan Christensen, and he will also talk about the problem of uniqueness in calculus operations.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. So let me start with some brief remarks. Piotr, I think we met first time in Varsity in 1995. It was actually to met Miska. And there was a summer school with Stefan Müller, microstructure. It was good old days where all the conferences I went to, they involved force convexity in some form. That's not so important, but this talk will get back to some force convexity. So first time we have one paper together. It's an engineering paper. It's for something with a bridge between Fedorov and the co-area formula. As well. The talk here is, Sander was saying it's about uniqueness in mechanical variations. And so this is ongoing work. And some of you will have heard some of it before. There was some developments. I think that I can convince you that's the right microphone. So the talk is based on some work with Frans Wertheim and Jan Koolhaas. And so to say a little bit about what it's about. So it's somewhere in between these two bullet points here, uniqueness and non-uniqueness. So you have a variational interval, and you want to minimize it over some Dirichlet-class solar function. This index G is the Dirichlet condition that you impose on the full boundary. And here the domain, as you can see, it's D. D is the open disk in R2, and the boundary condition to me is always a function that is defined on the full space. And then you just look at the difference of the function, say, here U and G, and you require that is W12 not on the space W on D. And so as a uniqueness, so one case where you definitely have uniqueness is if you can find positive constants, so that if you take your integrand E, so the integrand, and you subtract a small constant times the Dirichlet integral, then you stay in your convex. And if you have this, then you have a unique minimizer. So that is clear. On the other hand, there's also a case where you have non-uniqueness, a well-known case is the minimal surface problem with the codimension 2, so non-parametric one. And here you see that the integral is this function here, and it is strictly polyconvex. It's not the case that you can subtract a small constant out of the Dirichlet integral, but it's strictly polyconvex, and it's known by work by Lawson and Osterman that the minimizers can be non-unique. And it's actually the case that you can prescribe on the unit circle, you can prescribe a real analytic function, and then you can find two real analytic functions up to the boundary that minimize this variational integral. And so this construction of Lawson and Osterman that concerns non-uniqueness was revisited by Spadaro in 2009, and because you have that the solutions are real analytic, so the deep sheet, so everything is happening on a compact set. And so you can modify the integrand to attain an integrand that is strongly polyconvex. It means simply that I can subtract a small constant times the integral, and my integrand is still polyconvex. And and Spadaro, of course, did some other things as well. But so this talk is a little bit about what is in between here. So what is the real decisive reason for non-uniqueness, or for uniqueness for that matter? And so I have a few of these slides, I apologize for that. So the general problem, you should imagine, is you have this energy. The star is because I'm not telling you how I define the integral. It's not super important, okay? So there could be different ways of defining this integral. And so there's an integrand, it's a function on the space of matrices. This Nagler U is a set of the Jacobi matrix of U. And again, I'm looking at the Lie classes, and because we actually both exponent P here plays a role, I'm going to allow it to be any number between 1 and infinity. So when you change the P, you have different phenomena appearing. So it makes some sense. And again, I emphasize, so omega, that's a bounded open set. I'm saying nothing about the boundary and the regularity of the boundary. So, because I'm not saying I can extend any function, but if I define my Lie class in this way, where G can be extended, then of course any function here can also be extended. So this is a cheeky way of avoiding discussing issues at the boundary. They are not important for this talk. Of course it's not, because there's nothing interesting there, but we focus in this situation. And then we have a forcing term. I call this guy a forcing term because I come from the calculus variations, and one of the motivating problems there is nonlinear elasticity, and then this would be like a forcing term. So that's why we call it like that. And F is really just in the dual space. Okay, so it's a bounded linear functional on W1 P naught. And so yeah, omega I already commented on. And so I want to have natural conditions on E that ensure the minimizers exist. And then I wonder whether they're unique. So that's a very general question. Maybe one should not expect a complete answer, but I will show you that the answer is almost never. They are almost never unique. Always you have if you don't have convexity. Yeah, so this slide is just to explain one of the natural notions. It's usually in terms of Portion convexity, which is this notion of Mori. So I assume you have an integrand. It's just a function on the space here of matrices. I assume it's continuous. And then I say it's Portion convex if this Jensen-type inequality is satisfied. And this phi here is then a Lipschitz function on the unit disk. And it's Portion convex if this goes everywhere. It's not super important to take in what this is doing. It's just to show you that there is a concept here behind. Many of you will know this very well. And it's super hard to actually work with this and write down explicit examples of functions that are Portion convex. So that's the definition of Portion convexity, and you can check that it's something we can work with. If you have growth conditions, so I want to work in W1P, so I have a growth condition that makes points well defined. And I like to have the possibility that my integrand can actually go to -infinity as fast as they can go to +infinity. And coming from the nonlinear elasticity, you might object to that, but I think that's a good reason for doing that. So bear with me for allowing this kind of generality. Also, if you ask questions about whether you have weak sequential continuity, you're forced to have a guy that is signed, because they have to be non-Lagrangians, and they go to -infinity as fast as they go to +infinity. So if you insist on a lower bound here, then you need non-Lagrangians, and we don't want to do that. And then there's so there's a growth condition, there's a Portion convexity condition, and then in conjunction with the results of Mori and Myers, Fusco, to some degree also to the Chen and myself, you have lowers in the continuity in the sequential weak lowers in the continuity in the weak topology of W1P, provided you have a Dirichlet boundary condition. All conditions here, by the way, are sharp. Okay? And then the other condition you need for existence, if you use a direct method, is coercivity. You can also get that from Portion convexity. So it's Portion convexity is really all over the place. These are the natural conditions. And so this is also a characterization of coercivity. Portion convexity is a characterization of sequential weakness. So if you want to apply the direct method for existence, there's no way around Portion convexity. Okay? So that's the natural condition. So we can prove existence of minimizers under these assumptions here. And then it's, as I said already, it's known that you do have uniqueness. But these examples are specific, so as this minimal surface integrants in order so we have certain symmetries that they construct, and you also can also automatically construct a minimizer that do not have that is not symmetric with respect to these symmetries, and therefore they conclude you have more minimizers. But it's something that is very specific to this particular experiment. So it would be nice to have something else that you could check and not having to actually write down the solution each time you want to check for uniqueness or non-uniqueness. Okay, and then there's a number of other references here I like, but they are kind of only related to what I'm talking about here. So there's this Badaro one, and then there's Zhu, Yang, and Chang. So they have some papers from 1890, I think there are some later ones as well, where they elaborate on some of these constructions of Gauss and Rosberg. And I mean, there are lots of very nice papers here, unrelated stuff, uniqueness and non-uniqueness. Okay, so now I talk about uniqueness versus non-uniqueness, and I should tell you that the problem is hard because, uniqueness is just about the corner, always. I don't know whether you have ever come across the variational principle of Stecker. It says that you have generic uniqueness, and this is a very general statement. It's not even as general as it could be. So if X is a reflexive Banach space, and you have a proper lower semi-continuous function, so this is lower semi-continuous in the strong topology, and you have this coercivity condition satisfied, then there is a dense G-delta subset called a capital G of the dual space, so that if you look at these perturbed functionals, so this is like the forcing circle, then you have a unique minimizer. So you just need to perturb it slightly, and then you have a unique minimizer. So it's not only like it's unique, but it's a strong minimizer. So it's true of Velcro, it means that whenever you take a minimizer in sequence, it will convert strongly to the minimizer. So it's a quite strong result. And okay, so we have this. Now, when I'm talking about uniqueness, how can you characterize uniqueness? Well, you could use this convexity, right? So if you have strict convexity, you certainly have uniqueness. So how far is that actually from uniqueness? I mean, the other way around. And if you're having just one-dimensional pictures, you see that it's not very far. So because if I do, okay, I don't even need to draw the graph. But in 1D, if you have a function that is, say, nice and continuous and coercive, and it's not convex, it means that you can support it with a line that touches it in 2 points. That's your little f there. You tilt it, and you get 2 minimizers. That means that if you have a functional with a property that for all these tilts that you can use, that's bounded linear functionals, you get a unique minimizer. Well, then you're convex. And so it's a little bit harder to actually prove that. And it's not, not this result that I'm going to put it back in general, but it's really the essence is the same. So if you have a reflexive Banach space, and just like the Stecker, you don't exactly need something like reflexive. So, and you have a functional, and now it's proper functional, not plus infinity identically, it's never minus infinity. Then you notice here, it's sequentially weakly lost. You have to boost a little bit on the technical assumption, but then I still have the coercivity. And then it says, if there exists a convex and dense subset D of the dual space, so that this is a set of minimizers, let's just instead of convex just say that it's singleton, that's certainly convex. Then the functional is convex. Okay, so you see it's very close to Stecker. The only difference is convex. So before I had a dense delta subset in space. Now I say it's convex, and then it's convex. That's the only difference. Okay, so you see convexity is playing a role here. So now I want to investigate this a little bit further. So I also want to emphasize another thing, is this this thing, the dense, I don't need that D is equal to X star. It is convenient. So that is a remark here that I should make. And it's not on the slide, but it's a remark. And the reason that I made it as a remark is that my focus is different. My focus is actually on non-uniqueness, because the other thing is so seldom. Okay? So if you have the statement here for D equal to X star, then the function f is, it's not strictly convex, but it's what is known as essentially strictly convex. And if your function is a finite value, that's just strictly convex. And but that's not where I want to go. So if you don't have it for a dense subset, it need not be strictly convex, no, essentially strictly convex. So yeah, focus on convexity. So this is just to spell it out. So you have a quasi-convex guy, you have the growth condition, the coercivity condition, and so we're just reformulating it in these Caguar terms. So you have a boundary condition, you have your dense convex subsets, smooth functions. Actually, I think maybe we should use polynomials instead, because polynomials are really analytic, and then you can play games there. So that's would be another. Any dense and convex subset would do. So here I chose the infinity combination. And then if you have a unique minimizer, that means that this guy is convex on this Dirichlet class. Okay, so that's the abstract considerations. And now, of course, it calls for a definition. We have a lot of, in calculation, we have a lot of different convexity notions. Rank 1 convexity, force convexity, polar convexity, and of course convexity, and this one, and I'll show you some other ones later on the slides. But so we will add this one and not be ashamed of it. So E is functionally convex if you have this condition for all open and bounded subsets and all Dirichlet data. Like this. And now notice that I'm more relaxed regarding the P here, so P is the infinity. So these are W1 infinity functions, they're Lipschitz functions because I allow them, they can all be extended. They're really Lipschitz functions. I don't care about the finer details of W functions. Because I'm doing it, I'm going to, as I said, I'm using it destructively, I'm going to show you that we don't have limits. And you can make some observations about this functional convexity. So when I state the definition of functional convexity was with reference to the unit group, but a simple exhaustion argument, covering argument, allow you to move around between all kinds of different bounded loading sets. And it's the same here. So, and it's really just a change of variables and fitting. So E is functionally convex if and only if you can find one bounded open non-empty set only naught, that you did some P naught, so that you have convexity of this guy in this particular Dirichlet class. And my favorite is to take only naught to be the unit ball, the unit tube, and G naught to be 0. If you have convexity, then you have it. So that allows you to focus. So this is really just an observation, it's not a result. And another observation is even more like an observation. But it is like, okay, assume that E is T2. Okay? And then I say E is functionally convex, and now I just differentiate twice in the direction of phi at U. Okay? And then you have this for all maps U in W1 infinity, and for all test functions phi in W1 infinity. Okay? And so this gives a hint as to what to expect, because this inequality here, it looks innocent, but it's actually very demanding. Because notice U is arbitrary, the gradient need not be continuous. What is this? Well, there's a large limit to 0, but if I added epsilon times the norm of phi squared, I would not change that much. Then it would be a coercivity inequality. And it would be a coercivity inequality where you have measurable coefficients. In the vectorial case, you do not usually have those. So if, for example, Chandra Harmat, the intrinsic condition is satisfied, if you put x-dependent coefficients and that is continuous, you don't have processivity. You don't have Gaussian inequality. So that's a warning flag going up here that says, okay, don't expect this to hold too often. And indeed, so this is the list of examples that we have. So what are the functionally convex integrals? So meaning, when do we have uniqueness? So if you're not on this list, you do not expect to have uniqueness. Okay, if you're convex, that's the, but you of course have to boost it restricting convex. Okay, to really ensure you have uniqueness. If you have a degenerate piece, you can do all kinds of things. But remember, I'm doing the opposite. I'm really looking for non-uniqueness. So you have to be convex. Okay, but you have to be rank 1 convex quadratic form. And it's just the usual proof for quasi-convexity of a rank 1 convex quadratic form that you can find in the book by Lagrange and go back to Van Moe. And then non-Lagrangians, because non-Lagrangians are the guys that are constant on DNA classes. And then you can add these three, and then I don't know any of them. And so I suspect that these are all of them. But we have some results listed. I'll show you a little bit of that. So just to show you something about these guys. This is a simple example. So you have a strictly functionally convex interband that is not strictly convex. How can I do that? You take, let's just take p larger than 2. You form this is x symmetric part, x plus x transpose over 2. And just for show, I just take 2 by 2. And then it's not difficult to see that this is actually strictly functionally convex. But obviously, this is not strictly convex because you degenerate in the smooth symmetric direction. And but you would think that you have this, and it's such a nice guy that you should be able to have some kind of strong convexity, meaning I should be able to take epsilon times the norm to power p and subtract it and end up with something that stays convex. And that's never true. It's never true. And if you really want to analyze this properly, it's probably more difficult. And you end up with some kind of Berghofer function corresponding to symmetric and smooth symmetric. So this gives me opportunity to mention a result by Gabriel Cassesa. So it's easy to type.
Oh, here's the statement, right? Because the left-hand side is 0. So I can do the work.
Yeah. There's a T. Very bottom.
Very bottom, last line. Because gradient phi main is gradient phi is 0. The last line. Last line. No, yes.
Yeah. Left.
Left.
In the
But
right.
also the right.
It's
Transpose is missing.
what is missing here?
Transpose.
The transpose. Sorry.
I can do this.
I am looking at this. Yeah. Okay, I can too. And so, but they've really put a transpose here.
True.
And also, yeah.
Also the right.
Yeah. And then, yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. So that is a typo. I was thinking up here, but I didn't. Okay, yeah. And okay, now, so, and it is related to this question. It's related to this question. But it's not needed. This is simple, and this is not so simple. So this is sharp. And you have, for p different from 2, you never have equality here. So it's exactly as Ivanyian's conjecture for the burning and for inequality. So it's a solution of Ivanyian's conjecture for all inequality. And the proof is by expressing the Mies transform, these operators in terms of martingale transform. So it's like in Manuel's and Wang's work. But in this case, it works out in the sharp constant. In higher dimension, there's a square root of 3 here. It's independent of dimension. There's also a weighted version of the result. And there's an Ornish version, and there are lots of different things. The paper is out, and I recommend to have it. It's nice. And it's really easy. Okay, so I should compare this with other definitions of convexity. So, and I find it convenient to do it in this form here. So you take an integrand, it's continuous, and you define this auxiliary function for a matrix X and a test function phi, with this guy. And then we can say, E is quasi-convex provided we have that the minimum, well, it's 0 at 0, and for all X and phi. Then you have quasi-convexity. And the function of convexity is just saying that this function is convex for matrices X and on test function phi. And then I squeezed in between here, quasi-monotone slope. It's related to a notion of Sheffer. And you would be right to say, well, yeah, it's not really a convexity notion. No, it's a monotonicity notion. But it's a notion that Sheffer was interested in when he was analyzing the elliptic systems. And you can state it in this more general form here without having a derivative. So when you propose a monotone slope, if this function H is increasing, it's not difficult to show that F or E is functionally convex, implies that it's quasi-monotone, implies that it's quasi-convex. And to see the first one here, you can assume that you can differentiate H, and you just differentiate, and you see that the derivative has to be increasing, and since it's 0 at 0, it's largely to 0, so the function is increasing. And you have to replace phi by minus phi, you see that it's all fine. And then quasi-monotonicity implies quasi-convexity is, okay, H is 0 at 0, and then it's increasing on positive values. So you get that H of t is larger than or equal to 0 for t larger than 0, and then you can replace phi by minus phi, you call it a whole range. So it's a different way of saying quasi-convexity and quasi-monotonicity and functional convection. It's a convenient way. Okay. So these are notions that play a role in the calculus of variations, and you cannot reverse the implication. These are known examples. Maybe I just since I need to be careful with time, we will just say that these are known examples and follow just by calculation. So with the AI, that would be a lot easier, but back in the days when Chang did this, there were some calculations. Also the paper by Kim and Jan. Okay, there might be names there. But your functional convexity, if and only if k is less than or equal to 4, happens to be exactly the same as Bernoulli convexity. And this is, notice, this is an isotropic polynomial that is homogeneous of degree 4. Okay, so I also need to show you some results. And this is the first result. And so I'd like to say, you should think back to the list of potential examples, or the only examples that I know of functional convex integrands. There were the convex ones, the rank 1 convex ones, non-Lagrangians, and then some of them. And the reason that this result is first is because it's easiest. So you take a continuous integrand, now it's defined on general dimensions, and then it's subquadratic. So when I say it's subquadratic, I immediately eliminate two of the unit points. I cannot be a non-Lagrangian, but I can be, but I'm just an affine function. And I cannot be quadratic. So that means I only have convexity left. I only have convexity left, and it's much easier to show that functional convexity holds if and only if E is convex. If you don't have to also rebalance the other potential conditions that you would have, the quadratic forms popping up. And, so this makes it a lot easier. So if time permits, I'll show you how this proof goes. Maybe I'll show you how the proof goes. Sketches. Okay, so it has the purpose of also showing you that this quasi-convexity notion, you're never able to actually write the functions down. but you don't need to. Okay. So if I want to prove convexity, so I write out what do I have when I know my functional is functional convex. Now this is just writing up, maybe I call it, okay, yeah. Sorry for this, I call it F. This is writing out that I have weak point convexity. But because I'm continuous, I don't care about it. That's fine, that's enough. And so if I look at this guy, then I can say, well actually, if I define a loop functional on this concatenated matrix, there's capital 2n, 2 times capital N rows and n columns. And it's just f of x plus y plus f of x minus y minus 2f of x. And this inequality says that this guy is Cauchy convex at this concatenated 0. And then there's a nice formula of Lagrangian that allows us to say that this implies by Lagrangian's formula that the Cauchy convex envelope, that is the largest Cauchy convex function that is everywhere below f, or strict f, is everywhere real valued in Cauchy convex. Okay, so it's like this you have for convexity, but this Cauchy convexity is mysterious, so it might be that you don't have it there, but you do by Lagrangian's formula. And this is we'll translate into this. Okay, so we have this bound. Now F2C is this monster here. And if you look at it, you see that I can take f of x plus y, take one of these minus f of x, put it there, and the same with this other one. But then I can use Lipschitz estimates that you have for rank 1 convex function. And this subquadratic bound means that the Lipschitz constant is sublinear. Okay? So it is sublinear. This. Okay, so Cauchy convex function that is sublinear, you just look at it's also rank 1 convex. The convex function that is sublinear is a constant function. So FQC of xy is really independent of x. So I imagine here I fix the y and then I run this y. And now I just need to show you that f is actually 0. Because then I have that this is largely equal to 0, then it's midpoint convex and therefore it's convex because it's continuous. And that's it. Okay? And then it's a thing with so I don't want to, it's a trick. So maybe I want to say it. But I'm sure many of you have seen it somewhere. So I fix epsilon after that 0. And I look at this function, it is continuous and it's coercive. Right? So it has a minimizer. So there's an epsilon so that I have epsilon x epsilon plus minus y squared minus f of x epsilon plus minus y is larger than or equal to f of x epsilon. And this is true for all y. And there are two inequalities that you add them together and you get a bound for little f that says f of y is less than or equal to epsilon times y squared for all y and for all epsilon positive. So that means f of y is less than or equal to 0. And because it's 0 at 0 and it's rank 1 convex, it's constant equal to 0. And that's the convexity. But that's very elementary proof. And that's how you work with these quasi-finite forms. You never really have to write down explicit formulas, but just know that you have an envelope that is finite, and now you need to do things. So the outcome of this particular remark here is that whenever you have a quasi-convex integral that is subquadratic, not non-uniqueness, if you don't have convexity. Okay, then it becomes much more specialized. So, and then the proof here is not so easy anymore. So we have a continuous integral. It has to be on top of on 2 by 2 matrices, and it's isotropic. Isotropic for me means that it is invariant of abelian post-multiplication by special orthogonal matrices. It's a function just of the sign singular values. And then you need this. I think this is technical, but it really is not possible. So this is an improvement over a result we had 1 year ago. But still, I don't think it should be there. And then you have the following. So each functionally convex, if and only if the convex plus constant time determinant. And now you see we're mixing the bullet points. That's why it's so much harder to prove this. This one I don't want to say. But mixing the bullet points makes it much harder. So it's not just convex, you convex plus, and this you can interpret as a non-Lagrangian or as a quadratic form. So in the 2 by 2 case, a quadratic form is rank 1 convex, even only if it's positive semi-definite form plus a constant time determinant. You see, you can interpret this in either way. Just go into 3 dimensions, for example, the statement will not be clear, because then you have a quadratic form that is rank 1 convex, but not only convex. And it would be a lot harder to make this proof, I think. But again, so it underlines the list. I think it is that we only have these functionally convex integrals. Okay, so and then you get even more specialized. But so if you work in geometric function theory, you know that these guys, they are of some importance. So you should think about h of determinants, but it actually is more general than that. So you take a function g that you can write as some super function script g of minors of x, and the minors are of order at least 2. So you do not allow the entries directly of the matrix. They have to enter through some minor. Okay, and then we have the following result. It is that we have a quasi-monotone slope, if and only if t is f(i). Remember, quasi-monotone slope, you might not remember that, but that was a weaker condition than functional convexity. So it's not functionally convex. And it's interesting for the following reason. Remember, maybe you don't, but this proof was supposed to show you that the way to work with quasi-convex mismatch is by using envelopes and abstract properties, rather than actually writing them down. And so envelopes are important. And now we don't know that much, except for this postulated list of examples on these functional convex integrals. And so we would like to take envelopes, of course. And of course, you can take abstract envelopes in a Granner space, okay? But we want our envelopes to be at the level of the integrand. Can we take envelopes of integration for functional conversion? This example shows that you cannot. So you take the determinant, that's another Lagrangian, and minus the determinant, that's another non-Lagrangian, and take the max of the 2. You get the absolute value of the determinant. This is not affine, so it's also monotone slope. And there's no notion of envelope for functional convexity. And it somehow against it. I think our list is correct. I don't know how to do it. Okay. When I started saying that if you work in geometric function theory, there are some integrands that you would maybe be interested in. That's Hadamard type energy. It should be called Hadamard type energy and not Neo-Hookean energy, because Hadamard was the first to consider this kind of energy. I learned that in a paper by Fritz John. So that's a function that has the following properties. So the Hadamard is H here. And that's this is the Frobenius norm. Sorry. This is the Frobenius norm, and this is a function H of the Jacobian. And I'm just doing the 2x2 case. The philosophy is that if I can prove non-uniqueness there, I can prove it in any dimension. 2 times 2 is the hardest. So I just go there. And H here is convex, blah, 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 blah. And then the setup is like this. Use the direct method. And we can show that we minimize. The question is whether they exist. So we see, so I have to kind of localize the results I had before. And I can do that. And together with Bernd, we have shown that this guy here is not even forcible control slope. So that means you just look at the set, but the determinant is positive. You have the condition there. So that means you don't have uniqueness. And so I showed this to John Ball. Said, yeah, well, maybe you don't have uniqueness, but are the minimizers homeomorphisms? Or are they one-to-one? It's not so clear when you have a Hadamard material, because it depends on how fast this H goes to 0. So and I mean, many of you know this much better than I do, but there are conditions that need to be met. So, but we can show that you have none. And sometimes they will not be homeomorphisms. But okay, but that's a much better model. Much better. What is this one? So it's a polyconvex isotropic elastic energy, and it has a so-called isochoric volumetric split. And it means that you can write it in this way. It's a function g of the distortion. So now this is the distortion defined relative to the Frobenius norm. So that's 1/2 distortion plus 1 over distortion, and then a function of the Jacobian. And I just confine myself, I don't mention our result, I just confine ourselves to the polyconvex case. Okay? So I take the case where both G of Kx and H of Jx are polyconvex. So overall is the polyconvex as well. When I impose this coercivity condition, I have coercivity in W12 by simply multiplying out things. And this model here is model of Flory. And it's really, the first step, if you have it with linear elasticity, and you have an isotropic material, then can always be split into such a form, a linearized version of that. And then the first step, when you go to non-linear, is really this one. It's the natural one to go to. And so the assumptions mean that we can apply the direct method, and the question is whether you have uniqueness there. And for this one, I don't know the first reference with it, but for this one, finiteness will imply that you have uniqueness provided the boundary condition is nice. And so nice here means I take omega p to be the unit ball, a unit disk, and I take the identity. And then any minimizer of this function on the previous slide is a homeomorphism. Then from the unit disk, closed unit disk, the closed unit disk has integral distortion. It's actually square integral, and the inverse is of the same quantity. And the question is whether we have uniqueness here, and we don't have uniqueness here either. So, and not only don't you have uniqueness, so I can guarantee that you give me any number, say k, and I can produce k homeomorphic maps that minimize this guy. Any k. And I think I do. But then I would need the forcing term to be a W-1, 2 function or distribution. I think I cannot do it with this infinity function with compact support. And the reason is some kind of, because you have identity on the boundary, you can do some covering. And then you can cover with these guys. And if I can put infinitely many tubes in my covering, I can alternate between two of the minimizers. And then you have uncountably many potential combinations. So I think it's really, I think probably it's uncountably many. real universes here. This is just giving you the example with 2. And there are other examples. I mean, the point is simply that so it's not difficult to work out examples. So the examples here with Bernd are based on laminates, second order laminates. Okay, it's not, you don't need to do something very fancy. But once you start wanting to prove all general theorems, you always need longer. Maybe it's just because we don't understand this. In my case, certainly very likely. So, okay, so the next thing that I want to say a little bit about is, can we restore uniqueness? So I should also make a conclusion from these examples. It is, so why it was always, I was always led to think that linear elasticity, that's small deformations, and if you have a larger deformation, you have to be forced to do some non-linear elasticity. But actually, non-linear elasticity is also perturbative, right? So if even at the level of absolute minimizers, the DFT boundary condition or the full boundary, you do not have uniqueness. How are you going to distinguish any of these solutions? So I think it means that you should consider it to be perturbative as a theory as well. It doesn't mean that it's not useful, but it's perturbative. And what is the mechanism behind the non-uniqueness? It's probably some kind of buckling. So buckling is known if you have mixed boundary condition, right? And this column that you press on the top, and then you can borrow to each of the sides, and you don't know which one. There's some additional information you don't have. But now that's not possible in these examples because please write the boundary everywhere. So it's a different story. But there must be some kind of internal buckling. I have no idea how it happens, but it happens. Something is happening inside the material. Okay, so I want to pursue this further. And I want to know whether I can prove something interesting under these assumptions that I call natural conditions. And natural conditions, now we're just doing quadratic growth, just to get an idea of quadratic psychosis. So I take the abstract T2 integrand, quadratic growth, and coercivity in this sense. And so just this is another message slide. So it's about strong force convexity, where it's just that you can subtract the small constant times the integral and still have force convexity and coercivity. So I already mentioned that. So this is strong force convexity. It's actually equivalent to coercivity on general Euclidean classes. The issue here is, and this is annoying that you have this C2 here. You see nicely here it's inside F as quadratic growth. This guy quadratic growth, and then there's this constant here. It doesn't scale nicely if I happen to, if you want to multiply u by t, I would do it here as well. This doesn't just stand there and have not been multiplied by anything. It doesn't scale nicely. And also, if you think back to linear theory, you will know that coercivity is always in terms of Bording inequality. Bording inequality is perfectly homogeneous. Okay, so it has more structure and more information. So we would like to prove a Bording, and you can do that. It's not difficult to do. This is really just following from definition. It's inequality of this form. And normally you would have a quadratic form here with expected coefficient. Now it's this non-linear thing here. But it's really the left-hand side is exactly the same. And so here, so it follows just you satisfy no condition except for this regularity. It need not be minimizing, it need not be related to F in any way. Okay, so that's why this is not a deep result. And so you have this inequality. And this looks quite innocent, and you might be excluded to think that this should hold always. I mean, it certainly holds for C1, but it should hold also for W1 2 And I would initially agree with you, but know now that it's not true. You can quantify the importance. But so it links to the previous theme of convexity, because if you look at, now I go back, sorry, I go back here. So if this is positive, I have convexity, right? I was saying about the tangents to the graph, the tangent plane to the graph. That's, if this would be positive, this would be, it would mean that this functional is convex gradually. And so to make this positive proportion, you have to find a configuration inequality. And the best constant in configuration inequality has to be the smallest eigenvalue in the Dirichlet Passion. So we want to know a little bit about the Dirichlet Passion. This is something to be easy to up. So the Dirichlet Passion, so it has in L2, it has a discrete spectrum. It's positive, and each eigenvalue has a finite geometric multiplicity, and it runs off to plot infinity. So that's what we know. It's also a self-adjoint operator, so they are orthogonal in the L2 scalar product. So imagine I want to make the left-hand side, I want to make it positive, okay? And and it won't happen in the first eigenspace. The Poisson inequality constant is too small. Okay, so I go to the second eigenspace. That means that this is the first eigenspace, right? And there I have another constant. It might also be too small, but I'll keep on going and over goes to plus infinity. Eventually, I will succeed. And it means that this is positive. And so I have convexity. But I don't have convexity unrestrictedly. I have it if I stay away from this sum of the first eigenspaces. Okay, so that's a finite dimensional subspace where just instead I have convexity on the complement of a finite dimension. So all the non-convexity that is happening, and there was a person in the previous slides, is really this finite dimension, provided you have a boundary. The Bording inequality, and by trivializes things, it makes things finite dimensional. Okay, and then, so it limits the non-convexity, and it cannot always hold. And so one consequence of Bording inequality that you get by using the other properties of the eigenvalue for the Passion is that okay, if U happens to be external, that means it satisfies your Lagrange equation, and it satisfies the Bording inequality. Then if you only use variations with small volume variation, okay, that varies outside, so to say, just variation that varies outside small balls, then you actually minimize. So it's locally minimizing in the sense of what happens with variations. And so that means you can run the usual proofs of partial regularity, going back to Evans, for example. And that means these examples by Müller and Sherlock of extremers that are Lipschitz but nowhere C1, they cannot have a Bording inequality. So they cannot. To be honest with you, I'm not sure you need to go that deep to see that you don't have it, but that's very bad. It just means you cannot expect to have them. Okay, Bording inequality is something that you actually, or maybe it's you could lecture that it holds for almost. You can predict it holds for minimizers. That would be a very interesting theorem. It would solve the regularity problem in the Poisson cases. So it would be interesting if you could prove that. So it would mean that you have no singularities in 2 dimensions, and in n dimensions, you have the same situation as you have for the convex case. Which kind of would be amazing. The problem is that's free. What is allowed to, of course. And so the conditional complexity are these conditions on the Bording inequality. Or if you want C1 up to the boundary. It is just that you have the uniqueness of the smallness conditions. Okay, and that's this condition is probably and it's, in some sense it shouldn't be there, but it's there. It's up to be quantified properly, but I think one can get rid of this condition. So okay, there are lots of stuff here on the slide, but it's just smallness condition under additional assumption of a Bording inequality guarantees uniqueness. You can do also stationary experiments. And I don't think I want to really talk too much about the proof. Just maybe a remark here. So this Gaussian inequality, so it's some kind of nonlinear threshold property. And the best constant here is related to a nonlinear eigenvalue problem. And I thought we were the first to think in terms of that and think about the Rayleigh type quotient. But actually it turns out that Lindqvist did that for Peter Paschen in the 80s and Tillin maybe already in the 70s. So we're not the first, we're the first one to do it for general quotient convex. But it's a good thing to do because you can use the Gaussian inequality to get coercivity or equicoercivity, and then you can run the usual argument for Heinz fluctuation. And once you have that, then the proof of the conditional uniqueness result is not hard. And as I said, there's this M floating around. So this is possible a fix of that. It's a result that is proved into a result by Stefan Luck. And so, for example, it gives you, so in 3 dimensions, for example, take the determinant of Van Euclid. And then I produced a smooth quasi-convex function. The equal determinant in this ball, and then outside larger concentric ball, it's a constant times the norm squared. And it's quasi-convex and smooth. So it allows you to, whatever your quasi-convex function is doing at infinity, it doesn't matter. On a compact set, we can see even if it's non-local, it's a non-local notion. So we can kind of change asymptotic behavior as we wish. And then my AI generated last slide. Happy birthday.
Thank you for the interesting talk. Are there any questions or comments? If this is not the case, I would like to ask the example of non-uniqueness with the integrability of the dispersion. So you don't have the exact formula for different minimizers. You describe them in the limiting process.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. We don't. Yeah, okay. So no, it's a very good point. I want to answer a little bit. This is it. Yeah. So we have no idea how these guys look like. So we just know they exist.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? If there is none, then let me bring it again. 30 minutes coffee break.